Hey there, Spacemakers. Welcome back to our podcast about making space for a meaningful life by doing less, not more. I'm Daniel C., your host, joined by my space-making partner in crime, Matt Bain. If you're tuning in for the first time, we're exploring the fracturing of our attention and how to reclaim your focus. If you notice that your concentration is waning and you're running to stand still, well, then you're in the right place. A special thank you to our amazing show sponsor, St. Luke's Health, our partner from my home state of Tasmania. They're not just ensuring health, they're inspiring us to become the healthiest island on the planet.
The Spacemakers with Daniel C. and Matt Bain.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel from The Spacemakers. I'm back with my friend Matt Bain.
Hey Dan, hey everyone.
And we are talking about how to make space for some silence or quiet in a noisy world. This is part of a broader series about the fracturing of our attention, how we can concentrate better by practicing concentration. And today's episode is inspired by this popular study, which I really like, by a guy called Timothy Wilson from the University of Virginia. And so Timothy Wilson and his team got together and they were trying to explore how people manage being by themselves in silence or alone. More particularly, actually, they were studying how people respond when reflecting on their own thoughts. And so he got people in a room and he just said, look, spend 6 to 15 minutes by yourself, no devices, no notifications, and tell us what it's like to think about your thoughts. And a lot of people said it was painful. And so Timothy Wilson and his team thought, oh, that's unusual, painful, just to be alone for 6 minutes. And so he thought maybe it's the environment. So then rather than being in the uni or the lab, they put people in their own homes, in the comfort of their lounge rooms and repeated the experiment. And people said being alone in their lounge room for 15 minutes by themselves was painful. And so they thought, what do they mean by painful? So I don't know how they got ethics for this, but they ended up attaching electrodes to people's bodies and then giving them painful electric shocks, which was so painful that people said they would pay $5 or more not to have that zap again. And then they put that cohort into a room by themselves for 6 to 15 minutes and said, I want you to sit there and reflect on your own thoughts. Now, there's this zapping machine in the corner of the room. We don't encourage you to use it, but feel free if you want to. And the results were that 67% of men and 25% of women chose to give themselves painful electric shocks rather than have 6 minutes thinking about their own thoughts. And I just think that, A, is a pretty cool study, but B, it says something about our culture where whenever we're at the bus stop, whenever we're at the train station or in the supermarket, whenever we're at the park and we have a moment of silence, we habitually reach for our phone, don't we? And we just distract ourselves. We give ourselves these shocks. And we've untrained ourselves to experience long periods of silence or solitude. We've untrained ourselves to reflect on our own thoughts for a significant period of time. And we believe, and we're going to talk about this, Matt, that silence is really important and that actually we need to reclaim the practices of being by ourselves and reflecting on our thoughts if we are to experience a more focused, meaningful life. So that's what we're going to talk about.
Wow, self-administered shocks. People prefer to shock themselves, voluntarily shock themselves.
Yeah, self-administered shocks. And we do it all the time. So look, we're going to talk about this in the episode, but before we do...
I don't do it all the time.
So we're going to talk about this in a moment, but we usually start each episode by reflecting back on what we did. Because for us, making space and paying attention is not about what you know, it's actually about what you do with your life. And so that's why we've been pausing and having activities at the end of each episode to get people to do something to retrain their focus muscles. So what was the activity?
Well, there was a couple of options within the overall activity, and they all pertained to life planning, trying to work out what the greater why or the greater yes was. So you had more motivation and reason to say no to distractions and getting your attention captured.
Because our premise from our experience as well is that you can't remove digital distractions and then retrain your focus muscles on what really matters unless you know what really matters. And actually to have a greater sense of your why, your purpose, your values, or the people who matter in your life, that takes some self-reflection, right?
Yes.
And that's hard work. But to do that work is a bit like knowing where you're heading, and therefore that shapes the path for how to get there. So how'd you go with that?
To be honest, I really enjoyed it. So I enjoyed it, mate. Is that the right response? I found it very useful. I ended up going with the 5-year future exercise. So imagining myself in 5 years' time, literally exactly 5 years' time, and then looking back and answering those questions that we had under that heading. And I particularly found the last question in all those prompts very useful. And that was the question that related to, what do you wish that you'd done more of? And what do you wish you'd done less of?
Thinking about yourself 5 years into the future.
Yeah, 5 years. Yeah. And I'll tell you that, because I've been reflecting upon this a bit, and the most useful feature, I think, about that particular 5-year exercise is that hard and fast 5-year time frame. Because like we talked about, we don't live in complete isolation. We exist as in, so what's important to me and what I want to pay attention to is largely linked to the people who I'm already doing life with, right? So having 5 years, having that hard and fast time frame, meant that I could map out how old I was going to be in 5 years' time, as well as the people who I'm currently doing life with. And that immediately starts having real-world implications for how I want to spend my time, who I want to pay attention to, and what my yes is going to be in the here and now. Because in 5 years' time, a lot of those people are going to be in very different life stages, and that's going to impact where I'm at. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It actually reminds me of something I did a few years ago.
Yeah.
Where, this is me being a complete geek, but I got a Trello board out and I put in the next 5 years and then the next 10, the next 10, the next 10 until, I'm 90 or 80 and it's my lifespan. Yeah. And we just wrote down the kind of things that we might expect to pop up. And it was super helpful because I was like, okay, I actually said, 2 years ago, I expect my father to pass away in the next 5. I thought, this is when my mum might get older. This is when we'll have to look after our parents. This is when our kids leave home. This is when we have no more school fees to pay. And just those broad landscape changes have been super helpful because one of the insights I gained was actually the next 3 to 5 years with orthodontics and 3 lots of school fees and dealing with, sicknesses and all that kind of stuff, career planning. This is our real pressure point, particularly financially, and we're really squeezed for time. So therefore, let's be kind on ourselves with how we use our money because in 5 more years, things change. So that kind of broader planning can be quite useful.
Yes. Yeah.
And even the idea that actually if we're going to be caring for sick parents in, let's say, 15 years, let's make sure we have some overseas holidays and some things the next year because we may not have the same flexibility in the future. Yeah,
that's it. They're all concrete examples of how, again, I need to be mindful of this stuff when it comes to working out and planning what I want to pay and who I want to pay attention to over the next 5 years, because this stuff is real world. I'm not going to be able to change it. My kids are going to get older. My friends are going to get older. I'm going to get older.
And if you have a plan, well, then you can make good decisions about how you use your time now and, more importantly, how you focus your attention.
Yeah.
So, look, that was that activity. The actual activity was to simply book time in the calendar for people to do it. So you're ahead of the game.
Yeah, I got to step ahead.
And to download the activity sheet, I think it's at spacemakers.au/life plan.
Yes.
And it's got the questions as well as a process to help you make progress.
And to answer that first question, if I'm like most people, that is a significant hurdle because I needed I was booking at least an hour. Yeah. So I thought, how am I going to go about that? And believe it or not, and we'll get into this, I booked that time when I was catching a flight. So I found it a really good time to do that exercise, to do that hard thinking when I was on a flight.
Well, people say if you want out of the box thinking, get out of the box. Well, maybe if you want longer term, big picture thinking, get into the air.
Get out of the box, jump into a giant metal tube. Yeah.
All right. So let's get into this episode about how to make silence in a world that is super noisy and recapture our attention. And I want to start with a story about when I was 19 years old, and it was really one of the most formative experiences of my life. It's really changed who I am. And so I did this development program, a leadership development program, where we did language development, we did some self-reflection for a year, and then we went to Vanuatu, just me and 6 other people, and we did kind of a cross-cultural leadership experience. And it was the first time where I started to experience the challenges and benefits of being still and alone. So in the prep to heading to Vanuatu, they had a one-day kind of silent retreat. And so I'm a 19-year-old guy, and I had no smartphones back then. Wasn't allowed to use the internet, but we weren't even allowed to read books. We were just, we were given a pen and paper, and we were simply meant to write down our thoughts and to go walking and to reflect on our thoughts. I think it was for about 6 hours. And I found that an incredibly hard experience.
Sorry, did you say 6 hours?
6 hours by myself, no other people, complete solitude, and to reflect about my thoughts. So yeah, if I wanted to, I would have electrocuted myself, I guarantee it, if I had the opportunity. And And it was challenging. And there were times where I'm like, wow, I've been able to notice things I hadn't noticed before. But at the same time, I had all these painful emotions and thoughts and feelings about girlfriends that had broken up with me, about my parents' divorce, about disappointments, about confusion, about my career. And it was actually quite hard to be silent and still. But you know my personality, I come up with a challenge and I have to beat it. And so I'm like, well, that is something I want to reflect on, because why can't I be by myself for a day? And why is that so painful? So it kind of got me thinking. And then I ended up in Vanuatu for nearly about 6 weeks. And for 3 of those weeks, it was me and another 19-year-old guy in a tiny village in a remote island. There was no communication, no running water, no power. We hunted for our food. We slept in grass huts. And we're the only English speakers, so we had to speak Bislamar the whole time. And there were no other adults around, who were part of the program. You'd never be allowed to do this nowadays.
Yeah.
But it was full on. And part of the practice is we had to sit by ourselves for 1 hour a day in the jungle of Vanuatu, boiling hot, 80% humidity. I'm getting bitten by these massive mosquitoes, and all I had to do was sit and journal my thoughts for that hour. I think we might have read some scripture, there might have been some readings, but ultimately I was by myself and I was learning to be silent. And it was super hard, but like reps at the gym, by the end of that 3-4 week period, I absolutely loved it, and I felt completely full from the inside out. It was physically hard, but there was something about that time that helped me discover the power of stillness and solitude. And so I came back, and I think I've taken that experience away with me, and the idea that you can retrain yourself to enjoy being still, and that stillness, that space, can transform the rest of how you live your life. So that's my big experience, my formative experience with space. But do you have something similar? Or
have I spent 6 hours in the jungles of Vanuatu as a 19-year-old by myself?
Hunting wild boar and eating fruit bat. Yeah. Have you done that, or have you just gone soft?
Look, I've heard your story and I've seen Apocalypse Now. That's about the closest I'm probably going to get to that. But I've dearly wished to put myself in a position where I am silent for decent periods of time on a regular basis, in order to try to get more clarity, I suppose. Probably one of the catalysts for me is this quote that I came across. It's a pretty famous quote. It's been popularized now. I came across it maybe a couple of decades ago, but I remember the moment someone voiced it first, it really stuck with me. So it's by I want to say French philosopher and polymath, and I want to say hopefully 18th century. I should probably fact check that, but Blaise Pascal. So he's quoted as saying, all of humanity's problems stem from a person's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. All of humanity's problems stem from, he wrote man's originally, but we'll go with people's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Mm. So that had a really quite a profound influence on me, because I'm someone, as you know, who really gets by and thrives on information and stimulation. And so to sit just with my thoughts for even 5 minutes, let alone an hour or 6 hours at a time on a regular basis, I found quite confronting.
I mean, here's the thing I've experienced, that I think that when you're by yourself with your thoughts, if you're untrained, as in if you never have time, so every time you have 6 minutes, you pull out your phone and you zap yourself with some type of digital stimulation, well then you do end up filling your life with unprocessed emotions and thoughts. So disappointments, stuff that went wrong, things that you're angry about, people you haven't forgiven. And so when you're silent, it's like it just bubbles up, because you pay attention to what you need to pay attention to. And often it's shitty stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so therefore you avoid the silence, because every time you're still, you experience it. I was working with an executive once, and they said, I've suffered with clinical depression in the past, and the way I get over it is I outrun it. I'm never not busy, and if I ever stop, it'll come back. But I just don't think that's a smart way of doing it longer term.
Yeah,
I don't think it's workable.
Yeah.
And so you pause for long enough and the emotions come up, but then if you can work through that and practice that and journal it and maybe talk through it with others, I don't think it has to be solo. But if you can deal with the stuff in your life, well, then you end up in this place where you actually might enjoy being by yourself and have a sense of who you are, to be able to have the creative sense of, being silent and actually just delighting in it. I absolutely delight in
You really delight in it?
I love just sitting there looking at some trees.
Yeah.
And just and just being still.
Yeah.
I'm not a very still person. I'm a super active person, so I can't do it for long.
Yeah.
But, usually the stillness for me is moving. So even if I'm at the gym, I'll often not listen to stuff in an iPod or iPod, 1960? Oh
Your Walkman.
my Walkman. I won't be listening to stuff on my earbuds.
Yeah.
If I go walking, I'll think. And so that's,
Yeah,
I love it. Yeah, absolutely love it.
I love it, man. So again, I like this, but it seems that the risk for me is that it can seem to be such a high bar. My reality is more, I've got renos going on at the moment. I've got like a 42K chocolate Labrador who salivates all the time. And when I'm up, he's always up in my face. I've got a couple of kids. And so even just my physical environment on a daily basis is just noise.
Yeah.
There's always noise. And when I can do it, and I think this kind of ties back into that Pascal quote. I don't think he was meaning that this is going to be enjoyable at all. I think he was saying the reason that so many people avoid it is because exactly what you were saying before, it's confronting. It's confronting. It kind of shows you, it brings you face to face with perhaps the stuff that you've got to address in your life, or perhaps you can't change and it's beyond your control, and that can be confronting too. But at the same time, if people persisted, then they'd be able to work through it.
And the only thing I would say is I do think it can end up being a place of pleasure or delight. And I think it's similar to exercise at the gym. Okay, so typically when you start running or when you start any type of weights training, it just hurts. And there's a motivation because it's new and fresh, but it just hurts. It's not easy. And then there comes a stage where your body kind of starts to get used to it and you start to enjoy it. You start to feel better as a result of that. But what I've noticed is if you just follow the process, if you're not outcomes driven, but you just never miss a workout, you do it day after day after day after day for years and years, you just come to a point where actually if you don't have that exercise, your body misses it. You crave it and you crave the feeling. So it's actually a pleasure, and the motivation of the pleasure is what drives you, not the pain of having to get over something. And look, I'm speaking from my subjective experience. We're very different people as well. And so maybe the motivations are quite different.
But the couple of times, this is something I want to reapply myself to, but the couple of times when for maybe a week or two, I managed just to carve aside 5 minutes in the morning in my place in this imperfect environment. So it's still pretty early in the morning, maybe like the kids have just gone to school, so I guess it's not that early. But it's a little less silent, still not completely silent. I'll sit there and just try to shut my eyes and put it on a timer, nothing else, and just sit with my thoughts for 5 minutes at a time. And I managed to, again, sustain that for a couple of weeks. I think my PB was like a month. And it was great. So, but there's no way that I can claim ever reaching those dizzying heights of enjoyment or pleasure. But I found it was still immensely worthwhile because it was almost a sifting process for me. Stuff kind of sifted through. So my priorities became quite clear. The things that I should be paying attention to became a bit more vivid and hard to miss. So really helpful, even maybe necessary, not enjoyable, but it was clarifying.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. I agree that there's something about silence and space that can clarify where you're at, who you are, and how you engage in the world.
Yes.
All right, so Matt, I want to start this next section by being a bit smug and smart because our producer has just said that Blaise Pascal was a 17th century mathematician and philosopher.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah.
Now, I feel like one of those like dumb guys that's trying to come off as a smart guy. And that's a terrible feeling.
And I'm one of those smart guys that just looks up Google. Okay, so I don't want to pretend that I walk through life zen. I just really enjoy silence.
Yeah.
And actually there's a bit of a story between my Vanuatu story as a 19-year-old and then what happened, to lead me to this place I am now. I mean, life just got busy, as you can imagine, and my environment was full like everyone else's. And I found myself, early 30s, maybe nearly mid-30s, and I nearly burnt out. There was a time when I had one child, one baby, and one on the way, I think. I was building my own house as an owner-builder type contract, so it was just super busy. I was a physiotherapy manager at the time, helping leading a service. I think I was the chair of my church board, and we'd started off this side hustle called Spacemakers.
Yeah.
So it's just not a smart mix of stuff. And at that time, I am a doer. I'm a type A personality. I thought I could achieve anything, but I just started to get breathless. I started to not sleep well, and then I started to get breathless. And I would be breathless if I stood in front of my team and started to kind of do a team meeting. And then I found myself breathless at the dinner table. Eventually, I was breathless just reading, the Gruffalo to my child at night. And I'm like, oh, there's something seriously wrong. And I got concerned. So I went to the doctor, had lung function tests, I had heart tests, and thankfully there was nothing physically wrong with my body. And then when the GP heard about my lifestyle, he was like, I think this is anxiety. This is stress-related anxiety, and your body is saying it's time to pay attention to your life. And that was a real wake-up call. And the other thing that happened at the time is I had a very close friend who did burn out, and it started with breathlessness. He was a CEO of a big company, and he ended up hospitalized, and he's never been able to work at a high capacity again. And I saw that journey, and I thought, this is where I'm heading. And I didn't feel anxious in the sense of what I thought anxiety was, but it was anxiety. And so I took some sick leave. I made some hard decisions over the next few months to try to make some space in those kind of bigger picture commitments. But then I got a mentor, a kind of a coach, and we started to explore essentially what I would say is now the making and meaning of space. And I kind of remember that time back in Vanuatu when I was 19 and what it was like to sit in the jungle for an hour a day and reflect and pause and contemplate. And I started to put in small practices that build up over time, like a small reflective time in the morning where I wrote in my journal and said what I was thankful for. And eventually things like a digital Sabbath and significant rhythms annually, weekly and daily, where I made some space and enjoyed silence. And it actually recaptured my life again. And a lot of that is in my book, Spacemaker, which I wrote 10 years later, which was really my experience of how to shape your life in a rhythmical way so that you're working from a place of rest and from a place of solitude and silence rather than going, and then crashing with burnout. Now, I still get breathless occasionally, maybe once a year. And it's when I'm overcooking it. And it's like, oh, that's my body's way of saying the petrol's running out and don't go down that route again. And the solution is almost always stop being hyperactive and stop doing so much and put my to-do list down and just start to be still again.
Because you're still a type A personality. That hasn't changed. That's probably not going to change.
No, and I'm probably busier than ever before. If I look at what I actually do day by day, I mean, I've got a podcast, YouTube channel, I run my own business, I volunteer, I've got a community. So, it's not like my life is quiet, but my capacity is at where it is, I think, partly because of the productivity skills that you and I have, but also because of that sense of working from a place of space and knowing when to pause and when to stop. And that's made a huge difference.
Yeah, look, seriously, because I was around, you just hearing you talk reminds me of when all that went down. Because I was there, and that's one thing that I've continued to admire about you. Because you took some serious big steps to address that and change that. And that took a lot of courage. Seriously, that was and again, hats off to you. You have largely maintained that for decades now. And
you've been part of that journey of just pulling me up actually and keeping me accountable and asking questions when I need it. It's good to have friends who see your patterns and can go. I've got 2 or 3 friends like that who can say, hey, how are you going with your marriage? How are you going with your business? How are you going with your work?
Yeah.
So in the vein of making space and having silence, let's have a pause for 30 seconds. And I'd love you to think about, what does space mean for you? What does it mean for you to be silent? Do you suffer from solitude deprivation, and what might it look like for you to practice in some type of intentional way, being alone with your own thoughts? Enjoy the 30 seconds of space.
So, Dan, we talked a little bit about the ideas of space and silence, and we've started to touch on, in kind of maybe some general terms, about their benefits. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the specific benefits and virtues of silence and space.
Yeah, because I've done a lot of thinking on this, and I reckon there are 2 key things, at least for me. I'm sure there are other things. So one is deep thought, the ability to think and reflect and have self-reflection. And the other one is deep peace. I don't know if there's a better way to say it, but the sense of the inner life shaping the outer life. So why don't we talk about those two things? So deep thought, I always go back to a comment that one of my mentors once shared when I was a physiotherapy manager, and I was new in my job. I was getting busy. I was getting frantic like all new managers do. And this guy called Gil, he just told me a story, and he used to be an exec. He told me a story. He was basically looking out of the window once, having morning tea. I think he had a muffin and maybe having a coffee. And he was looking at the Derwent River. And there's some beautiful views. And he was just reflecting. And one of his teammates walked past and looked in and said, "Oh, Gil, you're working really hard earning the big bucks for the company, I see." And Gil, staring out of the window, kind of just confidently and carefully turned around and he looked and he said, "Actually, I'm doing my most important work." Just kept staring out of the window. And that's all he said. He didn't explain the story, but that has just stuck with me so much because I've reflected on that. And there's such a paradox to leadership that the further you go up the corporate ladder, the more you become a manager, a leader with responsibilities, or even a busy professional with being a parent, like the busier you become, the higher you go up the corporate ladder. And yet the more important it is to have space and silence to think. You are paid to do strategy. You're paid to make good decisions. You're paid to reflect on your risks and opportunities, to think about the culture of your team. You need to reflect on, the health of people in your department. Like, all these things require deep thought. And if you don't think, you end up just saying yes to everything and, running to stand still. And yet people just don't have time to think because of meetings and Teams messages and email and going from thing to thing. And so the thing about thinking, and Gil's story points it out to me beautifully, is that it does not look like work. If I was emailing or in a meeting or, typing something up, well, then I look like I'm doing something meaningful. But if I'm staring out of the window, reflecting on how I can actually develop strategy and change my culture, I'm not working.
Yeah. So you're saying it doesn't appear to be work. Whereas if I'm on email, it appears like I'm working, when in reality, it might always be fake work. It might always be like needless work.
Not only just does it appear that way, I think we fundamentally undervalue in Western culture the value of thought, of deep reflective practice and contemplation that actually involves silence. Previous generations gone by, like, we would talk a lot about the inner life, about virtues, about character development, about the importance of silence or meditation or solitude, or, all of these kind of contemplative practices. And they would be fundamental in helping us live a good life. Yes, we have meditation now, which is usually framed in terms of well-being and caring for self.
Yeah.
But I think contemplation is much broader than that. Yes, it helps us from the inside out. It helps us with resilience and anxiety and our mental health challenges. But I think just fundamentally having silence helps us to have both the moral conviction to make the decisions we need to make, as well as the strategic, broader life thoughts and choices that allow us to not only know where we're heading, but to allow us to do it in a way which is not full of anxiety or insecurity, that allows us to act on our decisions from a much more peaceful place. I think it's massively undervalued.
Okay. Yeah, so I hear you talking about almost silence being good for clarifying and strengthening perhaps convictions.
Yeah, I've probably gone a few places there. I suppose, essentially, I like the expression that wherever you go, you are. And ultimately, I think I think there's great value in having silence and stillness to discover who you are and to learn to be at peace with yourself and to enjoy your own company and have a sense of what you value on. So you end up essentially acting from a different mode. The actions might be the same in terms of the things you tick off, but the approach is different because you're acting from the inside out rather than the outside in. Yeah. You're doing it from a thoughtful place, an intentional place, a planned place, rather than just that kind of obsessive hurry.
Yeah. I like that. Again, probably the only thing that I want to add to that is the caveat. I'm all for like the peace and the clarity and the conviction at the end. And I'd love to get to that your mentor's kind of state of like Zen-like, feet on the desk, eating the muffin, hands behind the back of the head, staring out the window. But I just wouldn't want to underestimate the fact that I'm still going to have that drive there to prefer to shock myself at times along the way. Or like, Pascal said, it's going to be impossible for me to stay in that room by myself. Yeah.
You know, and I hear this all the time, that people feel guilty if they go for a walk at lunchtime. They feel guilty if they were to have some time to think. They feel guilty if they actually turn off notifications and actually do some work that requires planning. So it's not easy at all, even in small bites.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the last bit, which, I mean, I'll call it deep peace, but essentially it's about the inner life changing the outer life.
Yeah.
We've already talked about this to an extent, but I do love a story. I read it first in John Mark Comer's The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. It's a religious book, but it's a good book. And he gives this story about this explorer, and I don't know if it's a fable or if it's true, but this explorer in South America. So he got a bunch of people, indigenous people, they knew the lay of the land, and they would carry his stuff and obviously help him explore the Amazon. And he pushed them hard. You know, he wanted to get to some type of explored destination as fast as possible. And you can understand it. I've read stories from explorers where they die of these horrible diseases. So you want to go through quickly. But suddenly, in a random spot and a random point of time in the middle of the day, all of his indigenous crew sat down and they wouldn't move. He started yelling at them. He started cajoling, trying to get them to move. And eventually he said, you know, why aren't you moving? And the elder of the community said, well, we've been traveling for 3 days straight and it's time for our souls to catch up. And I really love that. I love that analogy that if we move too far forward in our activity, our souls can't catch up. You know, like, and in my experience, it's when I feel like a pancake, you know, wide and thin, where I'm just going after going after going, I'm ticking off tasks, I've got projects, I'm achieving things off my list, but I'm doing it from a place of anxiety or insecurity or just this internal drive to keep moving, then there's a place where my soul needs to catch up. And, you know, I didn't know that when I was 20. I think in my mid-40s, I'm now wise enough to not avoid it, but I realized, oh, okay, I'm in that place again where I'm kind of wound up, I don't know, like a spring. And because of that, I don't have the time to stop and think about how I'm working. And so I just work harder and I work faster and I go more and more until I get breathless. I've been there a few times, as opposed to working from a place of rest or having a space where your inner life is shaping the way in which you move. And I think that's an entirely different thing.
Yeah, this is good. So if I've heard you correctly, right, I think particularly I've talked about the benefits that I've gained or gleaned in terms of helping identify the what I should be doing, I think you've just spoken of both the benefits of silence and solitude to reveal not just the what, but also the why. So the motives behind why we do what we do. So, you know, working from a good motive, a healthy motive, as opposed to a poor motive. And lastly, I've heard you talk about the quality as well of the actual work that you're trying to undertake as well. So again, silence and solitude helps, leads to rest, which will help ultimately provide a better quality of work. Yeah, so three things right there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't, this is my experience, but do you have anything similar where you catch yourself, I don't know, maybe it's not on the to-do list treadmill.
Yeah.
That's my default. But you catch yourself working or acting from a place of guilt or insecurity or fear or anxiety because you haven't been still long enough to work on the inner life. It's very hard to describe. So I'm curious to hear it from a different perspective.
Yeah. Look, for me, it's those periods of solitude and silence. And I should say, as well as the multi-week runs that I've had of, say, 5 minutes, so very formalised and set in the morning, trying to make that a habit. As well as those periods, I've had other periods. Usually it's an environment such as literally being stuck on a plane or maybe being in a cafe by myself. You know, these environments where there's background noise, almost like a hum, but it helps me shift context. And I suppose I feel and experience some inner silence. And I've almost always got a journal with me. And I find it's really conducive in those spaces to just start getting clarity on things that I write down. And they're reminders usually for me, the little moments of insight and reminders. And they're almost always relating to what you've just been talking about. Why am I doing what I'm doing? How am I easily kind of pushed this way, swayed that way? What are some of the less than ideal motives that I often kind of work from?
Yeah.
So it's not, it's like, for me, in those spaces and contexts, it's not normally you should be doing this very specific small-scale task or project.
Yeah.
It's more the why.
Yeah, so you're lifting your head up.
Yeah.
And the space is giving you a broader context, which then changes how you act day by day, and it makes all the difference.
Yes. Yeah.
So to wrap up this thought before we go to the practical section, how does this all relate to regaining your attention? Because that's the whole purpose of this season 1, to regain our attention. So why is this conversation important if we're going to retrain our attention muscles?
Like we talked about before, there's so much vying for our attention, primarily from the bottom-up system that we've already discussed. I find the silence and the solitude, I need it to be able to turn down that stimulation and those potential sources of attention grabbing. I need that. And again, I need to have that silence and that solitude for the clarity and for that sifting process where things will present themselves, I think, usually of a high priority for my attention. Does that make sense? So again, the stuff that comes to me is usually around my greater yes, my why.
So when you slow down and you lift your eyes, silence gives you the ability to think about who are you, what do you value, how do you want to live? And the natural consequence of that is you delete Facebook Messenger. You delete whatever apps are vying for your attention, or you give more attention to things that really matter.
Yeah.
And that's often about shaping your environment, which we talk about next.
Yeah. Look, and to give like a concrete example, for me, it can be as helpful and as specific as I now realise that for the next month, I've got enough on my plate. That means I have to say no to almost any opportunity or invitation that crosses my path, my desk over the next month, because I know I've got enough on my plate and these really important areas I know are suffering. So I have to say no to this stuff. So that's really concrete and specific for me. They actually help. And particularly if I write that down and maybe I look at it the next day, it'll be a really useful reminder and prod. You've got to just say no.
Yeah. Hey, that reminds me, do you want to be on my YouTube channel and start an e-learning course with me?
And it's funny, like just going back to something you were saying before about lifting up your head. I was reading, I can't remember where, but when it comes to the bottoms up and the top down, the author made the point that historically, as human beings, and it still happens even in our modern world, when I want to do some quick, deep thinking and actually focus my attention, most of us look up. And the reason that we look up is because compared to our horizontal plane, there's all this stimulation. There's all this stuff that we naturally like grabbing our attention in the environment. If we look up, there's very little stimulation compared to what we see down here.
So physiologically, looking up will help you think differently.
Because I need to focus. I need to, again, like take my eyes and my focus off this immediate environment and its potential threats and benefits. And I need to instead of zone in and focus on something specific here. So I look up to turn down that distraction.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's something physiological because, the eyes are, part of the brain is attached to the eyes outside of it. So there is definitely a connection. So that's fascinating. Yeah. All right, well, let's get practical. Let's wrap up this conversation and get practical. But I'd be curious, what are our two best tips for getting started with practicing silence if you really do electrocute yourself every time you have 6 minutes of space?
Okay, for me, and again, this is really talking to myself because as I've already confessed, this is something that I want to reapply myself to over the next couple of weeks. My two big takeaways, very small steps to begin with. So for me, it is going to be 5 minutes with a timer in an admittedly imperfect environment as well, and just closing my eyes and being happy with that. So that's, again, small steps, 5 minutes at a time, every day, ideally same place, same time. And the second part of that is I'm not going to beat myself up about it. Perhaps not being as immediately fulfilling or as useful as I think it could be. So I'm going to kind of settle my expectations. And if I only make it 4 minutes, if I get distracted, again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time self-flagellating. I just want to persist and do that for at least 2 weeks.
Yeah, so just have 5 minutes a day and just practice
5 minutes a day, just practice it. Yep.
Yeah, I quite like looking at a candle or something that stops you from being distracted. If you need to have something to look at, you're smiling.
It doesn't surprise me.
That doesn't work for you.
Did you have a candle in the jungle?
Look, I'm going to go much more hardcore than yours because I've never found practicing the daily perspective as useful as the weekly or the annual. I find that, I just find the best practice for me. And I know it's a hard habit, but I just turn off all technologies where possible 1 day a week. And I've found that hardcore weekly rhythm has done a reset that is just so helpful. Now, I'm not saying that's simple at all. And in my book, I write heaps and heaps about how you might even approach that. But for me, it's probably the weekly rhythm more than the daily kind of reset that works. And the other one is actually having, I have a day a quarter, so summer, autumn, winter, spring, where I actually just have a whole day off of work to think, and I write a strategic plan for the next 3 months, and I reflect on my life and read on my habits. So, I mean, look, that's the opposite end of the spectrum for you. But look, somewhere in the middle, people might find something useful.
Yeah, that's right. All people could do both, in theory.
All at the same time. Come on! We're challenging you. So look, our final practice, though, is not so much about making space, because we want to continue the activity we started last week, which is essentially helping people think about their bigger why and come up with some type of broader sense of what they're trying to achieve. Because in the next few weeks, we're going to look at then how do you reduce the digital distractions of the environment in a practical way, and then how do you replace that space that you make with meaningful life activities and relationships. So we're taking on a process. So do you want to quickly recap the activity we gave last time and then just encourage people to do the same thing?
So this activity is going to involve either looking forward 5 years in advance of your life, imagining what your life looks like in that 5 years' time, with the aid of a bunch of prompting questions that we had. And it's worth stressing, as in my experience, those questions are a really good start, but don't feel absolutely restricted or confined by those as well.
There's 10 questions.
Is it 10?
There's quite a lot for each section. Now, they're just prompts, so pick the ones that work for you.
Yeah. So there's the 5-year option, which I found super useful. And then there's the imagining yourself at, say, your 80th birthday option. So imagine yourself, and again, there's a whole lot of really useful questions alongside that, but you're really envisioning your 80th birthday celebration, who's there and what they're saying about you, and what it is that they're kind of encouraging and praising you for and are thankful for in terms of what you've done with your life. And using both those, either of those perspectives or both those perspectives, to inform what your greater why and what your greater yes is going to be in relation to here and now and going forward.
Yeah. And look, this is not a one and done process.
No,
I think the idea of reflecting on where you're heading and having an intentional idea for your life. I don't like the plan idea as much, because I think life isn't planned and things don't go to plan and you'll change in different seasons, but at least to be intentional about who you want to be and where you want to end up in 5 or 80 years. It just gives you data that helps you make decisions about what you pay attention to now. So don't feel like it has to be a perfect exercise. Just download the resource sheets and get going. So you can get them at spacemakers.au/life plan.
Brilliant. And maybe for bonus points, like we talked about, do it with someone else. Or maybe just share the results of this exercise with someone who knows you, who loves you. Get their take on it too.
Sounds good.
That'd be useful.
So hopefully this conversation about silence and solitude and deliberately practicing some space in a noisy world, hopefully this has been useful for you. Next week, we are going to dive into a fun conversation with my good friend Tim Hines. The title is Everything Really Awesome When You're Part of an MS Team? We're going to talk about teams, notifications, and distraction in the workplace, and get super practical. But until next week, make space.
Make space, everyone.
The Spacemakers with Daniel C. and Matt Bain.
Big thanks to our sponsor, St Luke's Health, our partner from my home state of Tasmania. They're not just ensuring health, they're inspiring us to become the healthiest island on the planet.
Are you looking for a speaker at your next big event? Daniel C. is a best-selling author, TEDx speaker, and productivity consultant. To download his speaker kit and start a conversation, visit spacemakers.au. Until next time, make space.